Okay, so we have a second interprovider option C here. So what are the main structural components? Well, as before, we have eBGP from router 3, which is our PE here, to the remote AS P3-1 router. And inside the remote AS, there's a PE7, which we're going to be running external multi-protocol BGP2. So on that external BGP connection, as with all of the interprovider option Cs, of course we are running iNet unicast. We're also running labeled unicast, and we're lifting it up to the iNet 3 RIB. So that's pretty much the case in all of these examples. We're going to be running up in RIB iNet 3 for the labeled unicast, but don't forget that we do have the standard unicast on. And of course we have the labeled unicast running in the remote AS and the labeled unicast running in our AS. Now in this particular example, we're going to be stretching this VPLS VPN into the remote AS over to this PE7 with IP address here. So major structural components. We have the external BGP, we're running the labeled unicast. We have labeled unicast in the remote AS on the external connection and in our local AS. And then we have this external multi-protocol BGP connection from the route reflector across to the PE7. And you can see it here. This is the route reflector, so is this. And we can see that we have a neighbour here in the remote AS. And of course we're getting to that neighbour's IP address by the labeled unicast that comes across the eBGP. So now we have to take a look at some of the requirements of the signalling that we need in order to set up this MVPN and stretch it into this remote AS. Of course, the first point is that down the external multi-protocol BGP connection, we really need to have the VPN signaled. In this case, it's VPLS, and of course, the family here would be layer 2 VPN. So we turn that on from the route reflector to PE7. However, the data plane, once this VPN comes up, is going to require PE7 to be able to connect to 2, 3, 4 and 5, and vice versa. And that requires these particular loopback IP addresses coming out as labeled unicast on the iNet 3. Now, router 3 is both a PE in the VPLS and it's our external BGP peer to P3.1. So it's doing both. Router 3 has in its iNet 3 table all of the PEs, but the reason it has them is because each of those PEs are destinations of a tunnel, an LSP. And those LSPs, where fully meshed in this example, are going to be to every single PE, except of course itself. Router 3 doesn't see its own loopback as the destination of an LSP because of course it isn't. Consequently, Router 3's loopback in Router 3 isn't in the iNet 3 table, in the same way that Router 4's loopback in Router 4 also isn't in the iNet 3 table. So we have to lift the loopback of Router 3 up into the iNet 3 table. And this does seem familiar because of course in both of our large examples here we are lifting in each of the PEs the route reflector's loopback up into iNet 3. The reason that we're lifting the route reflector loopback up into iNet 3 is that for the root target family, the route reflector was changing the next hop to itself, and the easiest way to fix that was to have the route reflectors loopback in iNet 3 in all of the PEs so that they could resolve the route. However, it does mean that there's a RIB group already on iNet 0 placing routes into iNet 3. And this RIB group also has a policy attached to it. The policy statement is here. It's route reflector loopback to iNet 3, and there's a term 1 which lifts the route reflector loopback up, and we need to add to that the loopback of router 3 here, and then that way that will be lifted up into the iNet 3. Once that is done, on the export on the BGP to P3 here, P3.1, on that BGP export from RIB iNet 3, we can move all of the loopbacks out. And you can see here 172.35.0/24, that's the loopback range. The next issue here is that router 3 has an import policy with a policy statement on the BGP coming in from P31. And this is from a previous example. There's 3 terms. Term 3 up till now pretty much blocks everything. We're going to be changing that to just blocking the family INET, and this will allow the remote PE7 labeled unicast to come through. So we just have to remember to do that. And then all of the major components of this so far are complete. There's been a little bit of normalization here with the remote peer 23456, which is to do with the route reflector and its compatibility with 2-byte and 4-byte ASs. And now what we have to do is we have to actually normalize across here from the communities that the VPLS in the remote AS are using to the communities that we're using here. Finally, to complete this interprovider option C, we just have to do some normalization on the communities that the remote VPN is using and switch them across. So PE7 here, which we're calling P3 remote PE, basically we've got an import policy from BGP, from CE5 remote, delete CE5 remote, add CE5, the communities are defined down here, and then as an export from protocol BGP, from community C5, delete C5, add CE5 remote, then accept. And what that will do is that will normalize the VPN communities from the remote PE7, which we're calling here P3 remote PE, and we'll complete the task.